everyone. Hope you're all doing great. So, what are we doing here? This is a continuation of our GMAT CR assumption video that we had released a bit earlier about necessary versus sufficient conditions in GMAT CR assumptions. At the end of that 10 minutes video, if you remember, I gave you 3 homework questions in which you were supposed to apply uh, this test of what's a necessary condition, what's a sufficient condition, to see how exactly you get tested on the GMAT through this rather tricky concept. Also, I told you that I'll show you a trick, a technique by which you can definitely differentiate between two close options, one of them being necessary and the other one being sufficient. Yeah. So without further ado, we will get into it. But just before doing that, guys, if you find these videos helpful, and if you see that they are actually targeting some of the pain points that you might face with your GMAT prep, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing the video, the channel, and also commenting on the videos. Will really help us grow and keep making such videos in the future for you. It will help you, it will help every GMAT aspirant out there. Okay. All right. So with that, let's get into first solving the first question. All right, guys. So let's see. First, let's understand the stimulus really, really well. Yeah. Exports of United States wood pulp. Okay, so let's see what is going to happen to this to the US exports of wood pulp. So they will rise considerably during this year. Okay, so right away, the author has made a prediction that the wood pulp exports will rise. Now, this is not a fact because there is a prediction. This is a claim that will happen in the future, right? Therefore, it seems like right away we have the conclusion, right? A conclusion is what? A piece of opinion that is either as per the author or by a third party. Okay, a piece of opinion that you cannot establish as a fact, right? This you cannot establish as a fact whether it will rise considerably, not just rise, but rise considerably during this year. Clearly, there's an opinion. Now, whether there's a main conclusion or an intermediate opinion, we'll find out. But let's see. Let's see why the author thinks the exports of US wood pulp will rise a lot this year. Yeah. The reason for the rise, there you go. The reason for the rise is that the falling value of the dollar. Okay, so it seems like the dollar's value is falling in the market. All right. So if that happens, and I know that we are talking about exports. So right away, even without reading anything else, I can make certain, I can connect some dots. What kind of dots can I connect? So let's see. If I export, other countries have to purchase our goods and services, right? Now, what happens if the dollar value is falling? Well, if the dollar value is falling, that would mean that for other countries, they would have to spend relatively less to get the same products and services because our products and services are what are marked in dollars, right? The US goods and services are marked in US dollars. But if the dollar value itself is falling, essentially what's happening is for other countries, these commodities are becoming cheaper. Okay, fine. Let's keep that in mind and let's read on. The falling value of the dollar will make it cheaper, exactly as expected, for paper manufacturers in Japan and Western Europe. Okay, so these are the two geographies buying or rather, that can buy the wood pulp. And for them, as expected, these products will become cheaper. Okay, to buy American wood pulp than to get it from any other source. So this part is interesting. Not only will it get cheaper to get it from US for these two markets, in fact, it will be cheaper apparently than any other source. All right, so the dollar value being falling. So basically, at the end of the day, what is the reasoning being used? That listen, Japan and Western Europe will buy this because for them, buying the product from US is going to be the most cost effective solution for them. It's the cheapest option basically. Now, what am I thinking? So the author has based his prediction that exports will rise, or we can talk about that as sales, right? It's basically sales of the US. So the sales of US will rise based on the fact that the product has become cheaper. Now I'm thinking when I buy something, right? Yeah, price is one factor, but is price the only factor? No, right? I also think about other things. Um, for example, how's the quality? Does it match my preferences, etc., etc., right? Also, if you think about it, okay, maybe the price is so low that maybe they will want to buy. But what if US is not producing enough? Or what if the domestic demand is so high that despite there being demand from these markets, the US is not able to produce enough and meet their demand? In that case, no, they may not be able to export enough, right? So there are other factors also that are coming to my mind that may need to be considered when you're making this prediction. All right. So with that, let's jump into the options, but let's also read the question once. Which of the following is an assumption made in drawing the conclusion above? That is, is what is that necessary condition that must happen for the considerable rise to happen of exports of US pulp? Okay, let's read. The quality of wood pulp produced in the US would be adequate for the purposes of Japanese and Western European paper manufacturers. So they are talking about quality, and they're saying the quality would be adequate. That is, it will be, it will just be enough. It will meet the minimum specifications that these buyers have for wood pulp. Okay. And if the minimum specifications are met, maybe they might buy. Okay, fine. Let's hold on to that. Let's go to C for the moment. Paper manufacturers in Japan and Western Europe would prefer to use wood pulp produced in the US if cost were not a factor. Now, if cost were not a factor, now we know that for Western Europe and Japan, cost is actually not a factor anymore. Why is it not a factor? Because the dollar value has fallen. So cost is no longer a factor. It's basically almost irrelevant, right? Because it's so cheap. In fact, it's cheaper than any other source. It's basically irrelevant. Okay, so cost is not a factor. So if cost is not a factor, according to C, these buyers would actually prefer to use the wood pulp produced in the US. Now that really sounds good, right? If you prefer to buy something from me, you're most likely going to buy that. Seems like both are telling me, both are giving me reasons, both options are giving me reasons for these two markets to buy the product from US. But then, which one is the correct choice? Which one is the necessary condition that must happen for the exports to rise? It really comes down to two words, guys: adequate vis-a-vis prefer. Okay. And first off, let's differentiate between those two. And then I will talk about the technique that I will use to differentiate between these two choices, a technique that I talked about during the end of the last video, right? So, guys, what does adequate means? Adequate means bare minimum specification, the minimum specification that's needed. Now think about it. If you go to a market to buy something, and you have some minimum specifications in mind, and if a product does not meet those minimum specifications, will you buy that product regardless of how cheap it is? But it does not meet the minimum requirements. No, you're not going to buy that, because regardless of the price, if it does not meet the minimum requirements, it basically does not do your job. And that is why adequate, this is telling us that, listen, the quality is meeting the minimum requirements. On the other hand, C is talking about preference. Preference, guys, is not about minimum requirements. Preference is good to have, something that I would like to have. Okay. Think of it this way. Even if you do not prefer a product, but if it meets your minimum requirements and then the product happens to be really cheap, even though you do not prefer it, but at least you might think that, you know what, this might still do the work, because at least it meets my minimum requirements. So I can at least buy it. Okay. Point therefore is that preference is basically a sufficient condition, guys, whereas adequate is a necessary condition. Okay, it's giving us the bare minimum that must happen um, for these markets to buy the product. Now, let's apply the technique that I was talking about. The technique is known as trial by negation. Okay, TBN, trial by negation. What do we do? Whenever we are faced with two close choices for assumption questions, we apply this. How do we do that? We basically negate what is given in the option. Okay, so let's try and do that. The quality of the wood pulp produced in the US would not be adequate, would not be adequate for the purposes. Now, what happens? That means the minimum conditions will not be met, which means if the minimum conditions are not met, this will not happen. The conclusion is not going to happen. Okay, so the conclusion totally breaks. Now, let's come to option C. Paper manufacturers would not prefer, would not prefer, but we already discussed, even if they do not prefer, they may still buy it given the fact that the minimum requirements are met and the price is low. Okay, so not having the preference is not a guarantee that they will not buy the product from US. Therefore, the conclusion can still be valid even after negation of option C. Now, according to the trial by negation rule, once you negate an assumption choice, if upon negation the conclusion breaks, that means you're looking at the correct choice. That means you're looking at the mandatory condition, the necessary condition. What's the logic, guys? The logic is simple. When the necessary condition is negated, that means the necessary condition for the conclusion is not there anymore, and so the conclusion breaks. Whereas if you apply the same technique to the sufficient one, you will see that, you know what, there's still some chance of the conclusion happening, and therefore this cannot be a necessary condition. This cannot be my assumption. This is a sufficient condition, and therefore B is the correct choice, guys. All right. I hope you liked that question. I hope you saw how you could differentiate between a necessary condition and a choice that's a sufficient condition. All right, guys. So with that, let's move on to question number 2 in our homework collection. Yeah. Okay, there you go. So let's get started. Suppose again, let's understand the stimulus here. So a biologist is saying something. Okay, let's see. Species with broad geographic ranges. So we are talking about species with broad ranges, broad geographic ranges, probably tend to endure longer. Okay. So I have two things going on. Broad range, long endurance. Okay. Than species with narrow range. Okay, so broad range versus narrow range is broad range endures longer. Great. Let's carry on. So that's clearly a fact. The broader a species range, the more likely that species is to survive the extinction of populations in a few areas. So let's actually simplify that. So let's say broad range. Now let's imagine that there is a particular species and the range of the species is entire Africa. Okay, all of Africa is this species range. Yeah. On the other hand, let's consider a smaller continent. Let's talk about, let's say, Australia. Yeah. So species 2 is in Australia. The range is Australia. Species 1 range is Africa. Obviously, species 1 has a broader range, species 2 has a narrower range. Now, it says that the broader range, so species 1, can survive extinction of population in a few areas. So let's assume that this area, yeah, the Morocco side of Africa. Let's imagine that this area, this species got extinct. Now they are saying that listen, even if the population dies out here, you can still, the species by itself can still survive, this wipeout. And if I have to think about it, just let's just apply common sense and ask how is it surviving? Well, the reason is you still have these guys spread out all over here. So although a part of their population has been wiped out, these guys can still reproduce and they can still grow in number and they can still, survive this particular extinction that happened in these areas. Yeah, probably that's the logic, and that is the logic that makes more sense. Vis-a-vis, if I apply the same concept here for S2, let's imagine this part is extinct, right? Now, obviously, there are guys over here also, they are alive. But the point is, a smaller range of S2 is alive, okay? So you just have basically small numbers to deal with. So yeah, you can say that okay, these guys can also grow and survive better. But understand that we are speaking in comparative terms. We are not speaking in absolute terms. We are comparing S1 versus S2. And in comparative terms, it is very clear and obvious that it is easier for S1 to outgrow this population versus S2, simply because they are dealing with less number of the species being alive, and so to grow from there, it will be comparatively difficult to outgrow this extinction than it will be for S1 to outgrow this extinction, right? Okay, so now that we understand the logic, why broader range, longer endurance, because you can survive extinction in a few areas. Let's continue with the passage. Therefore, it is likely that the proportion of species, it is likely that I'm clearly reading an opinion, so clearly I am reading the conclusion. Okay. It is likely that the proportion of species with broad ranges, so S1, tends to gradually increase with time. Okay, it sort of follows from what we discussed just a minute ago. So let's consider what will happen, over 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. Point is, with time, these guys will multiply in number and the overall species will grow. And again, the entire passage is in comparative terms. Okay, we are right away setting the table by comparing S1 and S2. On the other hand, S2, if I say over time, what will happen? Well, over time, again, the guys who are alive, they can reproduce, yes, for sure. But if I have to talk about increase over time, surely that will be slower for these guys in comparison to S1, simply because you have more number of S1 to deal with. They have a broader range, they are more in number, therefore, and it will be easier for them to grow in number over time than it will be for S2, because the base number seems to be higher for S1 than it is for S2. Okay, and all of that is stemming from the fact that they are simply spread out over a large region. Okay, so yeah, just gives them higher chance that the the surviving members across the other non-extinct regions can always help the species grow, and they will thus increase over time faster than these guys for whom maybe only a few areas are left where they are alive. Okay, all right, I understand that. Now let's see, what's the question? The conclusion follows logically from the above if which of the following is assumed. Cool. With our understanding, let's now see Let's now go into the options. Yeah. There are now more species with broad geographic ranges now than with narrow geographic ranges. Okay, so the number of this is, current number of this is more than the current number of S2. However, what is exactly the conclusion? Conclusion is gradual increase. Just because the current number of S1 is more than current number of S2, does that guarantee or does that ensure that S1 has actually increased over time? What if S1 was anyway more to begin with than S2? Okay, so let's say S1 was initially 1000, S2 was, let's say, 20. What if now S1 has actually decreased to 800 and this has maybe stayed at 20? So even then, S1's number is higher than 20, but S1 has actually fallen over time. So this is also possible according to option A, but it does not meet the requirement of the conclusion. Therefore, A cannot be a necessary condition. A cannot be an assumption. Goes out. Without knowing the base numbers, for A to be the correct answer, we need to know what was the starting number of S1 and S2. Without knowing that, we cannot say that A is an assumption, right? Let's go to B. Most species can survive extinctions of population in a few areas as long as the species geographic range is not very narrow. Now, guys, say not very narrow. That means we also have the situation of is slightly narrow. So even if it's slightly narrow, they can survive extinction in a few areas. Okay, great. I understand that. But how is that going to tell me whether species with broader ranges, see, species with broader ranges, whether they tend to increase with time? Okay, it's not telling us that. It not very narrow means two things. Either the range is broad or the range is slightly narrow. Okay. Either way, for both cases, I know that okay, they are going to survive the extinction. But just because they are going to survive the extinction, from where am I coming to the conclusion that the number will actually increase with time? And that too specifically for broad ranges. Option B doesn't touch upon the fact that broad ranged species will actually increase with time. Simple surviving of extinction is not indicative of increase with time. Yeah. And also B does not necessarily point to what will happen to the broad range. Yeah, therefore B goes out. Now let's talk. Actually, I'll come to. I'll come to C and D in just a minute. Let's actually go to E. Any characteristic that makes a species tend to endure longer, which we know is over here broad range, will make it easier for that species to survive the extinction of population in a few areas. But we already know that, right? It's already given that more likely species to survive the extinction of population in a few areas. But again, how do we know that it's increasing with time? That we don't know. We have no idea. Therefore, it's again not ensuring that our conclusion will happen. So let's rule this out. Now, let's talk about C and D. Okay, very interesting. Now, look at C. If a population of a species in a particular area dies out, the species does not repopulate, generally does not repopulate that area. Okay, let's consider these two again. Yeah. So what it's saying is, let's say S2 is out over here, is gone. That means S2 will never come back here. So only these guys are left to grow the numbers. Okay, fine. On the other hand, and the same applies over here also, but I have a bigger number remaining to grow the population. Okay, fine. I understand that. And it definitely shows that, okay, listen, if these areas are not going to be populated again, that only makes the case stronger for the conclusion, right? Because it's almost like this is gone. So you have smaller numbers of S2, higher numbers of S1. And obviously, if that is the case, with time, S1 will keep increasing, right? Because you just have more numbers to multiply from, right? However, the point is, the question I'm asking is, so I'm actually now negating C. That species does repopulate. So if I negate C, what will happen? This not will be removed. So does repopulate that area. So let's imagine that these areas, S1 will again repopulate it, S2 will also repopulate it. Just because the repopulation is happening, does it mean that S1 will not increase with time? Or in comparison, S1 will not increase with time in comparison to S2? No, right? I mean, think about it. Let's say S1 comes back here, S2 comes back here. Even then, first off, it's going to take them some time for them to repopulate the area. And by the time they repopulate the area, this part, the part that's alive, the numbers of those species will have grown in that part because they are multiplied. Similarly, the numbers of this part will also grow because they are also multiplying. So by the time these two areas are repopulated, you're already looking at a bigger chunk of S1 from the alive portion, a bigger chunk of S2 in the alive portion. And again, who will be higher in number in the alive portion of S1 versus the alive portion of S2? Clearly S1 again, simply because they have more numbers to begin with to multiply from. So the point I'm trying to make is, even if these two areas are repopulated, even then, my conclusion can happen. That is, S1 can still increase at a faster rate in comparison to S2 over time. Yeah, it will still increase gradually over time. In fact, it will increase more than S2 in comparison to S2 over time, simply because you just have more number to play with, more range. Okay, therefore, even if these areas are repopulated, my conclusion doesn't really break. On the other hand, if they're not repopulated, that's really good for the conclusion. That's like sure shot thing that, you know what, every time you're wiping them out, that part is not repopulating. So let's say this entire Australia becomes extinct. That's it. S2 is gone. S2 cannot increase further, whereas S1 will keep increasing. So point being, if C is true, that is a sufficient condition. That ensures that, okay, my conclusion will definitely happen. But even if C is not true, point is, as we just saw, our conclusion can still happen. So C cannot be a necessary condition. C is in fact a sufficient condition, which is why C goes out, which is something we realized by negating C, right? Finally, you can understand that D is the correct choice. So let's read D. If a characteristic tends to help species endure longer, in this case that being broad range, then the proportion of species with that characteristic tends to gradually increase with time. Exactly what the conclusion says. Now let's negate this. Then the proportion of species with that characteristic does not tend, okay, does not tend to gradually increase with time. So basically, if I am a species, I have a broad range, but still I don't increase with time, what will happen? I am directly negating the conclusion. Therefore, the conclusion will totally break upon negation, which means D is 100% a necessary condition for the conclusion to be true, making D the correct assumption, whereas C was a sufficient choice. All right, guys, I hope you liked that also, and you saw the application again of the necessary was sufficient conundrum. And this was again an official question. Now, finally, let's move to one of my favorite questions that we have here at GMATWhiz. And let's see how we have also tested the same concept. Yeah, there you go. So Let's get started here. In Edonia, there are 9 small and 4 big universities catering to most of the critical higher educational needs of the country. Okay, fine. We have 9 small, 4 big universities to take care of education. Okay, great. The Edonian government, for a new policy, is planning to standardize. Uh, Sorry, my bad. Let's ignore this part over here. It's planning to standardize university education. Okay, it's planning to standardize university education. A part of the, so basically, when I say standardize, what does that mean? That means that, okay, you might have multiple universities. Some universities will have maybe some standards, others will have some different standards. But apparently, the government is saying, you know what, let's make it uniform. All universities should follow the same set of policies and rules. Okay, fine. A part of the plan is to institute a number of special academic and infrastructure specifications to which all universities will have to adhere. Exactly. So we'll have the same set of, rules, let's say, or specifications that all of them will have to adhere. That is how you can standardize, um, the policies for all the universities. However, none of the small universities can afford these new specifications. So the new specifications that have to be brought on, none of the small universities, these 9 small ones, they cannot afford to, integrate these specifications newly. Okay, they cannot do it in a fresh way. Okay, since they cannot afford that, what may happen is therefore only the 4 big universities will remain in business of catering to higher education. Yeah, well, if they cannot meet the specifications, they cannot run, they cannot be in existence, and therefore only the 4 big universities will remain, with the last statement obviously being the conclusion, because again, we are making a claim based on the fact that it seems like the small ones cannot adjust, cannot make the adjustment, cannot inculcate the new requirements. All right. So let's see the question. Which of the following is an assumption on which the author's argument relies? Okay. The imparting of higher education as per the new infrastructure specifications would be more complex than it is with current infrastructure. I mean, the education could be complex, that's fine, but how is it telling us anything about the fact that the small guys will not be able to keep up, and that they will run out of this, they will be run out of business, and only the 4 big guys will stay in business. The education getting complex is bad for the students. I mean, I feel bad for them, but it doesn't tell us whether the small ones will go out of business and the 4 big ones will stay. So therefore, this is sort of irrelevant, goes out. I'll come back to B and C very soon, and I think you know why. So let's go to D and E. The big universities will not go out of business, but we already know that if the government does not implement the new education policy. That is not basically what the conclusion is about. The conclusion is about what will happen if the education policy is in fact instituted, and that too, what will happen to the small ones. Yeah, the fact that the big ones will not go out of business is something that we anyway knew, um, but it does not, option D doesn't tell us whether institution of the new policies will basically get the small guys out of business. So again, irrelevant, goes out. The big universities will be able to accommodate the drastic influx of those students who would otherwise join the small universities. Again, we are talking about whether they have the capacity to incorporate more students. Let's see if they cannot. So what? It will again be bad for those students. They probably will have no education for a year or two. But will the big universities not stay in business because they cannot accommodate the students? No. So And also, how does he tell us anything about whether the small guys will have to be forced out of business? Nothing. So the ultimate conclusion that only the four big guys will stay, you're not providing support to that. You're not ensuring, yeah, that is what's going to happen because the nine small guys will go out. No, you're not talking about that at all. Therefore, E is definitely out. Let's go to B and C. In fact, let's first talk about B. Yeah, there is no possibility of the new policy being opposed and overturned by political supporters of the small universities. Well, if there is no possibility that the policy will be overturned, then yeah, like too bad for the nine small guys. They cannot adjust. Seems like they will go out of business if there is 0% possibility of the policy being overturned. But wait, though, let's negate this. If I negate this, what do I get? There is some. So if I negate no, I get some. So there is some possibility of the new policy being opposed and overturned. Now, what do we know? If a condition is a necessary condition, upon negation, the conclusion has to break. Let's see if that happens. There is some possibility of the new policy being overturned. Now, some could mean anything. It could mean 10% possibility, 5% possibility, or 90% possibility, 100% possibility, anything. Now, with some possibility, I basically do not know like whether the overturning will actually happen or not. The impact is at best ambiguous. Let's say there is only 2% possibility that the policy will get overturned. Who cares about that? That will not, that will basically ensure that these guys go out of business. Just 2% is nothing. You basically are looking at the new policies being instituted and too bad for the nine smaller guys. But what if the possibility is 90%? In that case, the nine small guys may still continue in business because there is such a high chance of the policy being overturned. But some, I cannot say what some means. It can be 2%, it can be 90%. So point is, the moment I negate option B, what I see is there is ambiguous impact on the conclusion. It does not necessarily break the conclusion, and hence B cannot be a mandatory condition. Yeah, some possibility that is ambiguous impact. And so B is actually a sufficient condition. Why is it a sufficient condition? Because if there is no possibility, that is really good. That will definitely ensure that the nine small guys go out. However, it's not a mandatory condition. Why is it not a mandatory condition? As I said, I don't need the possibility to be zero. Even if the possibility of getting overturned is 2%, even then my conclusion will hold. Even then, the nine small guys will go out. So this is a sufficient condition, not a mandatory condition, not a necessary condition, and hence cannot be the choice. Leaving with C the correct choice. The nine small universities do not currently impart higher education to a certain set of specifications that would match those that the government plans to institute. Let's negate this. The small universities do currently impart. Now imagine this. What did we know? We knew, sorry about that, we knew that the, the, the policies were not standardized before. The standards were different for every university. What if the smaller guys, what if they were anyway following the standards that the government is asking to be instituted now? Because they were different for everyone, right? The standards being followed were different for everyone. What if the nine small guys were actually anyway following the new ones? See, they don't have the money to institute these new policies all over again. But what if they don't have to? Because they already were following that. And upon standardization, basically, the new guys have to do absolutely zero change. The big guys maybe have to do the change because they were not following that. Right? So the moment I negate this, that they do currently impart the same specifications, suddenly the conclusion falls flat. Why? because there is no reason for the 9 smaller guys to go out of business. So why would only the 4 universities, so why would only the 4 big guys stay in business? No, the 9 small guys could also stay in business and will stay in business. Therefore, the moment I negate C, the conclusion breaks, making C the necessary condition for the conclusion. That is, I must ensure that the 9 small guys do not already have the specifications you need. That will then ensure that, yeah, they cannot afford the new ones and they will go out of business. But if they are already providing, what are we worried about, right? Therefore, C is the assumption. All right, guys. So I hope you understood how to differentiate between necessary versus sufficient condition, a very commonly tested aspect of CR assumption. And I hope you also understood the trial by negation technique. Apply it whenever you're stuck between two close choices. Always apply this test to see the impact on conclusion for assumption questions. I hope that was a great learning for you. With that, I will end this video. Take care, good luck. And again, consider liking, subscribing will really help us grow and keep coming back with more such videos.